I'm Nirupama Subramanian. With me today is Ambassador Navdeep Suri. He has served as India's ambassador to Egypt, to the UAE, and as well as to Australia. And today we are going to discuss the situation in Gaza, uh, Israel's operations in Gaza, the Palestinian territory of Gaza, have entered the fifth week. More than 10,000 civilians are dead. There seems to be no end to the fighting. Ambassador Suri, let me begin by asking you about, the vote last week in the United Nations General Assembly, which condemned the Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, and it made a specific reference to East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And India voted in favor of this resolution that condemned the Israeli settlements. What are we to make of this? Because India just supported Israel, it abstained from a vote that called for a humanitarian truce, which was widely seen as, a pro-Israel stand. So, what do you make of this support by India for this particular resolution?
So, Nirupama, I think the two resolutions are different. India's position on the two resolutions was appropriately different. This one was specifically on the issue of settlement, on the issue of illegal Israeli occupation of West Bank and Gaza and parts of Golan and East Jerusalem. And it's been India's consistent position, which is also aligned with the international and Indian position that if you want a two-state solution, then at some point Israel will have to vacate that occupation. Otherwise, there is no two-state solution. And we're being fairly consistent in our position on that. Our position on the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the whole issue of civilian casualties, the growing international chorus for an immediate ceasefire, I think has been more complicated, and where we seem to be leaning much more towards Israel in the stance that we have taken. And we chose to go along with the US position also taken by G7, which only called for humanitarian pauses and not for a ceasefire, which is what a lot of countries in the world are asking for. And so I think we were in a bit of a minority on that. And we were with the overwhelming voice of the international community when it comes to the issue of settlements. I guess this is a time when we, in terms of our actions and votes in the UN, will be trying to maintain a balance between the strategic partnership with Israel on one hand, and recognizing that Israel has been very forthcoming in terms of responding to India's defense and security needs, but also the considerable investment that this government has made in terms of our relationships with countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and how do you maintain those relationships as well, and try to convey a sense of equity and balance.
So you're saying that this was a balancing act. Of course, it is consistent with our demand for, or our support for, a two-state solution, which, as you rightly pointed out, can't happen without, if Israel goes on colonizing those areas. So you're saying also that this, are you saying that this was, in a sense, trying to make amends for the previous resolution where we were found a little out of step with the demand by most of the world for a ceasefire? Was it trying to do that?
Nirupama, I think because the two resolutions are so different, this one was a bit of a no-brainer. This was easy to do because it's consistent with our position. The earlier resolution, I think, was more complicated, and there is a debate. And we saw the G7 position, we saw the US position very strongly trying to find language around humanitarian pauses rather than a ceasefire. And I think the US is driving a lot of that agenda of saying that Israel, you can Israel to ceasefire until it has achieved its objective, which supposedly is the destruction of Hamas and its military infrastructure. So I think the
So,
two issues are different. That so that's why I think one was more complicated. The second one was much easier.
so let me ask you this. I mean, there have been these resolutions about Israeli settlements in the past, and India has voted for those resolutions as well. I mean, India has never supported Israeli settlements, and the world has never supported Israeli settlements. There is an overwhelming view that this is illegal occupation and Israel has to vacate, as you pointed out. So, this is a no-brainer in a sense that even Israel is not bothered about this resolution. It's seen so many of these resolutions, and it doesn't really affect Israel very much whether this resolution passed through the UNGA or not, because it's been there have been many of these resolutions. So what difference does it make, really? Does it?
On the ground, I don't think it does make any difference to Israel. I think Israel has acted with a degree of impunity, and much of that impunity is drawn from the willingness of the U.S. to use its veto in the UN Security Council and make sure that no major resolutions that are offensive to Israel are passed. But I think look, Nirupama, where we are today is in a sense the situation has moved so far beyond what you're seeing is the hypocrisy or the dual standards of the West being exposed, because you had the very same issues come up in Ukraine,
Exactly.
and the Western world took a certain position. So, for example, when the Russians cut off electricity to some cities, you had this whole outcry about collective punishment and the fact that it's illegal and it constitutes a war crime and all of that. Today, the similar things are happening at a much higher scale in Gaza. But the silence of the West is conspicuous. And it is only now, and again, thanks to the impact of social media. And I think the difference here being that perhaps unlike the wars between Gaza, Hamas and Israel in 2008 and 2014, this is really the first one that is being fought in the age of the social media, where it becomes much, much harder for one side to control the narrative. And so the visuals streaming out of Gaza, the pain and suffering, the fact that more than half the 11,000 plus persons killed so far are women and children and the elderly, is beginning to, I think, have an impact, if the governments in the West so far, certainly on the streets. And that's manifest in the huge protests that you're seeing in virtually every major Western city. And there's some hope that Gen Z, which is much more connected, still has a conscience that will perhaps start influencing the actions of the governments in these countries.
So what will it actually take now? Because we saw the US trying to say to Israel that let's have this humanitarian pause. And this was just 2 days ago, and Israel seems to have rebuffed that call, saying there's going to be, Netanyahu said there's going to be none of that. So how do you see that? I mean, the US, the most powerful country in the world, arguably, and it makes this call, and it's also funding Israel in a sense. I mean, it's pouring billions of dollars into Israel, and that country is asking for a pause, and Israel says nothing doing. So, I mean, if the most powerful country in the world can't get Israel to do it, who can?
Well, I think the question is not can, but does it wish to? And I think the result of the Biden administration giving the latitude that it has given to Israel to do pretty much as it pleases, and perhaps the U.S., the Biden administration is trying to follow what it thinks is a more nuanced policy of public statements of support for Israel, but tough talking behind the doors about trying to contain the damage and so on, is not washing in the Arab world. As we speak, I am in UAE for the Abu Dhabi Strategic Debate, which is their big annual strategic affairs conference, and the mood is angry. And I think I was at a discussion earlier this morning, and one of the things that came through, apart from what one speaker said, that this is Biden's war, he should take ownership and he's complicit in what is happening. Apart from that sentiment, what you're seeing is a resurgence of anti-US feeling across the Arab street. And the other thing which is coming through is loud and clear, is that the sense of a loss of hope uh, because of the impunity with which Israel is able to act. And that is manifest now in two distinct directions. The first is in Gaza itself. What's the end game? What next? Israel has declared its objective of destroying Hamas. But Hamas is not just an administrative entity or a political movement. You can destroy its infrastructure, perhaps, but you can't destroy an ideology. And there is a genuine fear in Arab capitals that the kind of disproportionate force that Israel is using, the kind of visuals that we are seeing of the pain and suffering of ordinary Palestinian people, is going to only contribute to further radicalization. That's the first thought, sort of, which is coming out, and that radicalization paradoxically will ensure that the kind of Islamist, extremist, fanatical ideology of destruction of Israel that Hamas advocates, which is antithetical to many in the Arab world.
Yeah.
Let me add. Gets sustenance from the growing radicalization that you will see, or you're beginning to see. So that's clear sort of dilemma of people, that where does this go from here? Even Israel, you're over the last 72 hours, you've seen one minister talking about the return of Israeli settlements into Gaza, as was the case before 2005. You had the Prime Minister speak about extended security control. And you have others talking about wholesale ejection of Palestinians out of North Gaza towards South, and potentially towards outside Gaza entirely. And none of these is conducive to any kind of peace in the region.
So you just spoke about the Arab world, but there is also an Arab reluctance to say things out as they are, to call a spade a spade. And so we haven't seen any of the Arab countries, the most powerful ones, maybe Saudi Arabia, UAE itself, censure Israel in a sense, publicly rebuke it.
They have. Nirupama, allow me to correct you. They have. What you have seen in the last 4 weeks. In the first flush, I think everybody was stunned by the brutality of the Hamas terrorist attack. And one thing that you've seen quite clearly, particularly in UAE, is there's zero tolerance for extremism or radicalization, and certainly zero tolerance on terrorism. And so, it was quite sort of expected that on October 7, there would be a strong denunciation of the Hamas attack. But once Israel started its campaign of retribution, and the civilian casualties kept mounting, you've seen a progressive hardening of the statements that have come out from Riyadh, from Abu Dhabi, certainly from Amman, certainly from Cairo. And I think the leaders are sensing the anger amongst their people. And I think what it perhaps does is, even if it doesn't reverse, but I think it certainly puts a freeze on the process of normalization been seeing between Israel and UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, others, post the Abraham Accords. You're beginning to see a freeze on that, and that in turn is going to, I think, have an effect, at least in the short term, on some of the very ambitious things that I2U2 was planning to do, or the India, Middle East, Europe corridor were supposed to do. But a lot of that was predicated on a normalization of relationships, right,
Right.
between the Saudis and the Israelis, as we were hearing, and all of that. Now that is up in the air, and so you can see the discomfort in the Arab world, where even countries that were on the path of normalization are now expressing their anger.
So is what is the future of the two-state solution now? Is from all this chaos, from all this war and bloodletting and all the bloodshed, what is going to emerge? How are we? You spoke about the end game. What should the end game ideally look like now?
So, if there's a realist in me and there's the optimist in me, let me bring out the optimist first. The optimist in me says that this October 7 and what's happened after October 7 is so unprecedented in scale that it could well lead up to a shakeup in the politics in the region. Now, I think that four things need to happen to make any kind of a settlement a possibility. First, there is a sense in optimistic quarters that post the war, there'll be a reckoning in Israel, and Netanyahu will go. And with him, hopefully, some of the policies that he has pursued will also go, and maybe a more centrist government will come into power that is much more willing to negotiate with the Palestinians for a two-state solution. That's number one. Number two, that Hamas will realize that its policy of no recognition of Israel and still wanting a destruction of Israel is not going to go anywhere. Maybe the pain and suffering of the Palestinian people that is happening on its watch will make it realize that it needs to change, particularly if it wants a seat on the negotiating table, and come around to some form of recognition of Israel. Number three, the Palestine Authority has been completely undermined by Netanyahu's governments over the last 14, 15 years. And there is a real need to revive, to strengthen the Palestine Authority, to restore its hypothetical or status as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Because today people are hearing Hamas's voice and not the PA's voice. Maybe for the Palestinian Authority to have a new leadership that enables it to be more active and dynamic. And number four, to actually have a US administration that comes forth with a new vision for a peace process, can think boldly and actually bring on board that vision, not just the Palestinians, but also the regional Arab actors. That's the optimistic view. And it's, as I said, it has four conditions. But the realist in me says, even if those four conditions fall into place, Israel has created facts on the ground. Today, you have 650,000 illegal Israeli settlers in settlements across the West Bank and East Jerusalem. When you look at the current map of the West Bank, there is no contiguity left between any two Palestinian urban settlements.
But
When you
Gaza
go
was
from
also colonized by the Israelis, and then that was reversed. So this is also reversible, isn't it? In a
the
sense,
scale was much smaller. I think the scale was much smaller, and for the Israeli ultra-right Orthodox, the sentimental attachment with places in the West Bank is very different from what it is with Gaza. The West Bank and Jerusalem have a different place in their iconography, their mythology, their faith, or whatever you want to call it. So I guess the realist in me says that under what conditions do we see an Israeli government that's willing to uproot these illegal settlements that have come up over the last decade and a half? And how do you create a viable Palestinian state? Or are you willing to start a different conversation, which is that the Palestinians can be persuaded to accept something less than a state, with the understanding that that's the best on offer that they can get, and it would be an improvement on their present
Like a city
situation.
state, like a city state, you're saying?
Like a territory with the no control over its borders, etc. I mean, if you look at definitions of statehood, then it may not meet
Yeah.
all the criteria. It may not tick all the boxes. I don't know. And the conference that I'm attending here, I think that's the sense of dismay, or the depressing reality that you come across. Like today, you have an immediate situation which demands a ceasefire so that the killing of civilians and children and women can end. You still have to address the issue of hostages, 240 of them, which we don't know what condition, how many are dead, how many are alive. And for Israel, it's a very, very large issue which must be addressed.
Yeah.
And you have the issue of Gaza itself. What happens to Gaza? I think once you try to find a way to resolve these three short term, you may be able to move to a situation of some kind of a resolution for the larger issue of the Palestinian statehood. So, no easy answers, unfortunately.
And just finally, I'd like to ask you one more question relating to India. Is there anything that India can do? Because Prime Minister Narendra Modi shares a special relationship with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And is there any diplomatic outreach that Prime Minister Modi can do with the Israeli Prime Minister in the same way that, he spoke to President Putin? Of course, that didn't really end the war, but is there something like that he can do here? Or is India not relevant at all to this, to this horrific?
I don't know. Yeah, never. I don't know whether relevant is the right word. I think, so since October 7th, Prime Minister Modi has spoken with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Mahmoud Abbas.
Yes.
And I think what we are trying to do is continue with our policy of a de-hyphenated relationship where we treat Israel separately and the Palestinian issue separately, and that's fair. I think more than relevance is leverage. I don't think we have the leverage either, certainly not on Israel, nor on the Palestinian actors. I mean, what leverage do we have on Hamas, for example, to bring them on the table? I think the only players who matter right now, and we haven't spoken about them as far as Hamas is concerned, are Egypt, because it has a border with Gaza, and historically, Egyptian intelligence services have had relationships over there. Qatar, because it is host to the Hamas leadership, the political leadership, if not a military one, and has been funding the Hamas administration over the last decade and more. And Iran, because Iran indirectly sort of supports this axis of resistance, which includes Hezbollah and Hamas and various other entities. These three on one side, and then perhaps the US, are the ones that have a degree of leverage. I mean, yesterday, both the CIA chief and the Mossad chief were in Doha for talks with the Qatar Prime Minister, and they're trying to work out. So I think in that scenario, we must have the humility to recognize that we don't have the cards to play, which would enable us to do something meaningful. And it's best to leave it to those people in the region who actually have some leverage on. The US has leverage on Israel to the extent that it wants to use it. And Egypt and Qatar and Iran are, in my opinion, the only actors that have some leverage on which they can use should they wish to.
And sorry, I said that was the last question, but I'm going to ask one more question. There was at the beginning of this, there was a feeling that this could become a huge conflagration that would sort of draw in other actors, such as Iran, and it could just become bigger than what it is right now. I mean, it's big as it is, but it could actually envelop the region further. Has that threat receded, you think?
Not at all. Not at all. I think there are two major risks at play. One is you have a hot border between Hezbollah and Israel in southern Lebanon. They've been firing at each other, but they still are maintaining these weird rules of engagement that exist since 2006 between a non-state actor like Hezbollah and a state like Israel, where civilian areas are not really being targeted actively. But you can see with every succeeding day that the conflict is getting hotter. It's increasing incrementally. And it just takes one mishit to escalate it into a full-blown second front for Israel with Hezbollah. And I would be not surprised if that happens. But equally, you have had a situation of militias from Iraq and Yemen and elsewhere firing missiles at US positions in Iraq and Syria. And several of these are seen to be, again, part of that axis of resistance that's aligned with Iran. And if one of those missiles actually strikes a US facility, kills 10, 15, 20 people, US defense personnel or contractors, and then the US chooses to react. We keep remembering Sarajevo, the death of the assassination of Duke Ferdinand, and how it started the First World War. There was a chain reaction that followed. And I think the important thing for people watching the region, much as we think that governments control events can also get out of control of governments and develop a life of their own. So I think the risk of a regional conflagration is very much alive, and it would take one accident to trigger it.
On that less than optimistic note, thank you very much, Ambassador Navdeep Suri. Thank you for your time. Thank you all for watching South Asia Matters on Awaaz South Asia. Thank you.